The rain did not merely fall, it conspired a relentless freezing deluge that sought out every fray in Eleanor Sterling's threadbare coat, reminding her with every shivering breath that the empire she had built was now a fortress she could no longer enter. Standing on the rain-slicked sidewalk of Lakeshore Drive, Eleanor looked up at the towering limestone facade of the mansion she had once gifted to her eldest daughter, Victoria. The windows were ablaze with warm amber light, casting long, mocking shadows across the manicured lawn. Inside, the muffled strains of a string quartet competed with the distant clink of crystal, a symphony of wealth and privilege that Eleanor herself had composed over 40 years of cutthroat negotiations and sleepless nights in the steel industry. Her fingers, gnarled by age and now numb from the biting Chicago wind, reached out to touch the heavy iron gate. She remembered when those gates were forged the finest sterling steel, designed to keep the world out and her family safe. Now, as she stood there looking like a ghost of the woman she used to be, she realized the gates worked both ways. Eleanor pressed the intercom, her voice a mere rasp against the howling wind. She told the security voice on the other end that she was a traveler seeking shelter, a woman who had lost her way. She didn't use her name. She wanted to see if the blood in Victoria's veins still carried a spark of the warmth they had shared when Victoria was a child clinging to her mother's neck in the nursery. When the massive front doors finally groaned open, Victoria stepped out onto the sheltered portico, draped in a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk. Her eyes sharp and calculating like her father's swept over Eleanor with a mixture of confusion and immediate visceral distaste. Victoria did not see the mother who had taught her how to read, or the woman who had sacrificed her own youth to ensure her daughters never knew a day of want. She saw a disheveled intruder, a smudge of poverty on the pristine canvas of her gala. Victoria's voice was a sharp, panicked hiss that cut through the sound of the rain. She asked what Eleanor was doing there, looking like a common beggar on a night when the city's most influential investors were gathered in her ballroom. She didn't offer a coat or a hand to help her mother over the threshold. Instead, she stepped forward to block the view from the foyer, her jewelry sparkling under the porch lights with a cold, predatory brilliance. Victoria whispered that her reputation was at a delicate tipping point, that she was being considered for the board of the Art Institute, and that the sight of a homeless-looking woman claiming kinship would be a scandal she could not afford. She told Eleanor to move along to find a shelter in the city and to never come to this house unannounced again. With a final, frantic glance at the street to ensure no paparazzi were lurking in the shadows, Victoria retreated into the warmth, and the heavy bolt of the door clicked into place with a finality that echoed in Eleanor's very bones. The walk to the train station was a blur of grey shadows and the rhythmic slapping of Eleanor's soaked shoes against the pavement. Her heart felt like a hollowed-out stone, heavy and cold. She thought back to the early days of Sterling iron and steel, the smell of the furnaces and the roar of the machinery. She had been a titan in a man's world, a woman who had built bridges and skyscrapers, yet she had failed to build a bridge to her own flesh and blood. She had raised Victoria to be strong and ambitious, but in that process it seemed she had accidentally excised the girl's capacity for empathy. As she sat on the screeching subway car surrounded by the late-night denizens of the city, Eleanor felt more alone than she ever had in the boardroom. The neon lights of the city flickered past the window, distorted by the rain, looking like dying stars falling into the blackness of Lake Michigan. Her second destination was the sleek glass and steel high-rise where Cassandra lived. Cassandra was the middle child, the brilliant legal mind of the family, a woman who viewed the world through the lens of logic and litigation. Her apartment was a minimalist sanctuary on the 50th floor overlooking the glittering grid of the city. Eleanor had to navigate the suspicion of a young doorman who looked at her dripping clothes as if they were a biohazard. Only after she produced an old faded photograph of a younger Cassandra did he reluctantly allow her to use the service elevator. When the doors opened into Cassandra's foyer, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect sterile coolness. There was no scent of cooking, no sound of life, only the low hum of the city's heartbeat vibrating through the glass walls. Cassandra appeared from her study, her face a mask of weary annoyance. She did not scream or hiss like Victoria. Instead, she spoke with a measured clinical detachment that was perhaps even more painful. She looked at Eleanor and began to lecture her on the irresponsibility of her appearance. She spoke about the legal implications of a matriarch being seen in such a state, the way it could affect the family's remaining trusts, and the public perception of the Sterling legacy. Cassandra didn't ask if Eleanor was cold or why her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip her elbows to stay still. Instead, she walked to a marble console table, took out her checkbook, and scribbled a number that would have paid for a month's rent in a luxury hotel. She slid the paper across the table as if she was serving a summons. She told Eleanor that she should use the money to find a proper residence and that they would discuss her mental health with a professional in the morning. She didn't offer a bed or a cup of tea. She simply checked her watch and mentioned a conference call with London that she couldn't miss. The door to the penthouse closed with the soft electronic chirp of a high-tech lock, leaving Eleanor standing in the silent hallway with a piece of paper that felt like a betrayal in ink. Eleanor didn't take the check. She left it fluttering on the floor of the hallway and walked back toward the elevator. The $60 she had in her pocket, which she had kept hidden, felt like more of a fortune than the thousands Cassandra had offered. She realized that her daughters had learned the value of everything but the price of nothing. They saw the world as a series of transactions, a ledger of gains and losses where love was an unlisted asset. She had spent their childhoods ensuring they were the best, the brightest, and the most powerful, but she had neglected to teach them how to be vulnerable. She had taught them how to win, but she had never taught them how to lose with grace or how to comfort those who had fallen. The final leg of her journey took her far from the gleaming towers and the polished stone of the Gold Coast. The train ride to the southern edge of the city was long and wearying the scenery, changing from luxury boutiques to boarded-up storefronts and flickering streetlights. This was where Serafina, her youngest, lived with her husband Gabriel. Serafina had always been the disappointment in the eyes of her sisters. She had walked away from her inheritance and the family business to work in a community garden and a youth outreach center. She had married a man who fixed vintage motorcycles and spent his weekends volunteering at a soup kitchen. Eleanor had been the harshest critic of all, telling Serafina that she was wasting the Sterling name on people who would never give her anything in return. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since a particularly bitter Thanksgiving where Eleanor had called Gabriel a common laborer with no ambition. As Eleanor walked down the narrow, cracked sidewalk toward the small, weather-beaten house at the end of the block, her courage began to fail. The porch light was dim and the paint was peeling in long strips like birch bark. She felt the weight of her judgments returning to haunt her. Why would Serafina open her door to a mother who had tried to crush her spirit? Why would she welcome a woman who had treated her husband with such disdain? Eleanor stood at the base of the wooden steps for a long time, the rain finally slowing to a miserable cold drizzle. She felt like a traveler at the gates of a kingdom she had once burned to the ground. When she finally reached out and knocked, the sound was tentative, a soft thud that she feared would be ignored. The door opened almost instantly, as if someone had been waiting just on the other side. Serafina stood there wrapped in a thick, oversized sweater, her face bathed in the soft light of a floor lamp. She didn't look at the wet coat or the mud-caked boots. She didn't look for a reason or a scandal. She simply let out a small, broken sound, a mixture of a sob and a laugh, and threw her arms around Eleanor's neck. The warmth of her daughter's embrace was the first heat Eleanor had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Serafina pulled her inside, calling out for Gabriel, her voice full of a frantic, joyful urgency. Gabriel appeared from the back of the house, his hands stained with grease and his eyes tired from a long day's work. When he saw Eleanor, he didn't scowl or remind her of her past insult. He simply nodded a quiet, respectful greeting and immediately began to move. He took Eleanor's wet coat and hung it near the small space heater. He brought a basin of warm water and a clean towel, kneeling on the floor to help her remove her ruined shoes. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't ask how a billionaire had ended up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm. He treated her like a guest of honor, his movements gentle and filled with a quiet dignity that humbled Eleanor more than any lecture could have. The house was small, the rooms cramped, and filled with the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was a far cry from the vast hollow halls of Victoria's mansion or the cold glass cage of Cassandra's penthouse. But as Eleanor sat in a mismatched armchair by the small fireplace, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for decades. Serafina brought her a bowl of thick vegetable stew and a piece of crusty bread sitting on the floor at her mother's feet, just as she had when she was a little girl. They didn't talk about the business, or the money, or the 3 years of silence. They talked about the garden, the children Serafina worked with, and the way the neighborhood came together during the winter months. In that small room, the Sterling name meant nothing, but the word mother meant everything. As the night deepened, the storm outside returned with a renewed fury, the wind rattling the window panes of the small house. Eleanor lay on the sofa, tucked under a heavy handmade quilt that smelled of lavender and home. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Through the thin walls she could hear the hushed voices of Serafina and Gabriel in the kitchen. They thought she was asleep, and their conversation was not one of resentment, but of sacrifice. Gabriel was speaking in a low, worried tone about the repair shop where he worked. The owner was struggling, and Gabriel's hours had been cut in half. Serafina mentioned that their own heating bill was overdue, and that they were nearly out of the small savings they had set aside for a new water heater. Then the conversation shifted to Eleanor. Serafina's voice was thick with emotion as she told Gabriel that she didn't care about the money or the past. She only cared that her mother looked so fragile and lost. She wondered how her sisters could have let this happen. Then Eleanor heard the sound of a small ceramic jar being opened. It was their emergency fund, a collection of crumpled $5 bills and loose change. Gabriel suggested they take their wedding bands to the jewelry exchange in the morning. He said that Eleanor needed to see a doctor for her cough and that she couldn't continue to wear those tattered clothes. Serafina agreed without a moment's hesitation, saying that a ring was just a symbol, but the woman in the next room was the reason she was alive. Eleanor bit her lip, the tears finally overflowing and soaking into the floral fabric of the sofa cushion. In the palaces of her other daughters there was an abundance of gold and a total absence of spirit. In this humble cottage there was an abundance of love and a total absence of wealth. She realized that she had spent her life measuring the world in steel and stock options, never understanding that the only true currency was the willingness to give when you had nothing left to lose. These two people, whom she had deemed failures, were the only ones who truly understood what it meant to be a Sterling. What Serafina and Gabriel did not know was that Eleanor Sterling's fall from grace was a carefully constructed fiction. 3 weeks earlier, Eleanor had sat in her office on the top floor of the Sterling building, watching her 2 eldest daughters through the security feed of the boardroom. She had seen them whispering with estate lawyers, their eyes greedily scanning the documents for her private accounts. She saw the way they looked at her, not as a parent, but as an obstacle to their final inheritance. A chilling realization had settled over her. She had built an empire, but she had raised vultures. To find the truth, she had orchestrated a masterstroke of deception. She had moved her billions into private, untraceable charitable trusts, resigned from her positions under the guise of a total financial collapse, and allowed the rumors of her ruin to catch fire in the city's gossip columns. She had traded her silk suits for rags and her limousine for the bus, all to see who would still love the woman who had nothing left to give. The test had been devastating, a sharp blade that had cut through the lies of her life to reveal the rot within her family. But it had also revealed a diamond in the rough. The following morning the sun rose over the neighborhood, casting a pale, hopeful light across the small living room. The air was crisp and clear after the storm. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table watching Serafina carefully pack a meager lunch for Gabriel. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the pawn shop plan, though neither of them mentioned it to Eleanor. Just as Gabriel reached for his worn work jacket, the quiet of the street was shattered by the low synchronized rumble of heavy engines. A fleet of black SUVs with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the modest houses like mirrors from another world. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, whispering in hushed tones as they watched several men in dark tailored suits step out of the vehicles. At the head of the group was Marcus Thorne, Eleanor's lead counsel, and the man who had helped her build the Sterling Empire from the ground up. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with the unshakable confidence of a man who held the keys to the city. When Marcus knocked on the door, Gabriel opened it, his face pale with confusion and a flicker of defensive anger. He thought perhaps they were there to seize the house or collect a debt. But Marcus didn't look at the small house with disdain. He looked at Eleanor, who was now standing at the kitchen table, her posture shifting in an instant. The weary, broken woman disappeared, replaced by the formidable matriarch who had once commanded an industry. She looked at Serafina and Gabriel, whose eyes were wide with shock, and she felt a surge of profound gratitude. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to explain the truth. She told them about the plan, the coldness of Victoria and Cassandra, and the heartbreaking realization she had reached on their doorsteps. She told them about the conversation she had overheard the night before, about the wedding rings and the willingness to sacrifice their only symbols of union for a mother who had given them nothing but judgment. As she spoke, Serafina began to cry, but they were not tears of anger. They were tears of overwhelming relief. Eleanor took Gabriel's calloused hand in hers and told him that he was the son she had always prayed for, a man of more character than any CEO she had ever met. The aftermath was a whirlwind of structural change. Eleanor didn't just return to her life, she dismantled the toxic parts of it and began again. The first order of business was a meeting in the grand boardroom of the Sterling building. She summoned Victoria and Cassandra, who arrived dressed in expensive mourning clothes, expecting to hear the final details of the liquidation of their mother's estate. They walked into the room with practiced expressions of manufactured grief already mentally dividing the remaining assets. When they saw Eleanor sitting at the head of the table, vibrant and commanding in a suit of sharp charcoal wool, the color drained from their faces as if a plug had been pulled. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She played the recordings from the security cameras at their homes, the slammed doors, the crumpled checks, the hissed insults about their social standing. She watched as their arrogance crumbled into a desperate, frantic scramble for excuses. Victoria tried to claim she was under immense pressure from her social circle. Cassandra argued that she was merely trying to protect the legal integrity of the family name. Eleanor silenced them with a single icy look that reminded them exactly who had built the chairs they were sitting in. She informed them that their trust funds were being dissolved and their positions within the company were terminated effective immediately. She told them she wasn't doing this to be cruel, but to be a mother for the first time in a way that actually mattered. She informed them that they would be given a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood and a basic salary on the condition that they worked in the company's new charitable foundation. They would be serving the very people they had looked down upon, learning the value of a day's labor and the necessity of human connection. Their inheritance was no longer a birthright. It was a goal they would have to earn through years of proven empathy and genuine service. For Serafina and Gabriel, the transformation was not about luxury, but about empowerment. Eleanor knew they wouldn't want a mansion, so she didn't offer one. Instead, she bought the entire derelict industrial block surrounding their small house. She funded the creation of the Sterling Community Center, a massive facility where Gabriel could run a vocational school for at-risk youth, teaching them the trades that built the country, and where Serafina could manage a citywide sanctuary for families in crisis. She gave them the resources to do what they already loved, but on a scale they had never dared to dream of. Eleanor herself moved into a renovated Victorian house just 2 doors down from them, choosing to be a grandmother and a neighbor rather than a distant queen in a limestone fortress. As the years passed, the story of Eleanor's test became a piece of modern legend in the city of Chicago. It was told in the high-stakes boardrooms as a warning against the rot of greed, and it was told in the quiet kitchens of the South Side as a reminder of the power of unconditional love. Eleanor found a peace she had never known in her decades of power. She spent her mornings working in the community garden with Serafina, her hands back in the earth where they belonged, and her evenings listening to Gabriel explain the intricate mechanics of a restored engine. She realized that she had been a builder of things for far too long, and she was finally learning how to be a builder of people. Victoria and Cassandra struggled at first. The transition from silk to cotton was a physical and emotional shock, and the loss of their social status felt like a slow public execution. But away from the toxic pressure of the elite and the constant need to perform for their peers, they began to change. Victoria found a strange, quiet satisfaction in organizing food distribution networks, discovering that she had a natural talent for logistics that could actually save lives. Cassandra used her formidable legal mind to help families fight wrongful evictions and navigate the complexities of the foster care system. They weren't forgiven overnight and the scars of their rejection remained, but for the first time in their lives, they were looking at people's hearts instead of their price tag. They began to visit the small Victorian house on Sunday nights, and though the conversations were often difficult, they were finally honest. The deepest lesson Eleanor carried with her was one she shared on her 85th birthday, surrounded by all three of her daughters and her many grandchildren in the courtyard of the community centre. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the sound of children's laughter. She looked at the faces around her, some weathered by the hard work of the centres, some fresh with the innocence of youth, but all of them filled with a genuine affection that money could never have bought. She spoke about the night of the storm, the freezing rain, and the doors that had been shut in her face. She told them that we often mistake our walls for our strength. We build houses of stone and fill them with gold thinking we are safe from the storms of life. But the true storm isn't the one that rages outside. It's the one that freezes the heart from the inside out. A house can be bought, sold, or lost in a market crash. A mansion is just a collection of expensive materials that will eventually return to the dust. A home, however, is a vessel for the spirit. It is the place where you are known not for what you own or what you have achieved, but for who you are when the lights go out. It is the place where the door is always unlocked because there is nothing inside worth stealing that isn't already being given away for free. Eleanor looked at Serafina, then at Victoria and Cassandra, who were sitting together for the first time in years without an argument or a hidden agenda. She saw the wedding rings on Serafina's hand, the same ones that were almost lost to a pawn shop on a night of desperation, and she smiled with a clarity she had never possessed in her youth. The greatest investment of her life hadn't been in steel or real estate or the stock market. It had been the moment she stood in the rain, stripped of her armor, and learned that love doesn't need a key to open a door. It only needs a heart that knows how to listen to the silence of another's pain. In the end, when the lights of the great city fade and the noise of the world finally falls silent, the only wealth that matters is the kindness we showed when we had absolutely nothing to gain, and the doors we opened when everyone else turned away.